What would you do if it was 1348 and someone in your house suddenly developed a fever? By the next morning, painful black swellings appear under their arms. By nightfall, they're coughing blood. And the worst part, no hospital exists to take them to. There are no antibiotics, no ambulances, no emergency rooms, and the local doctor doesn't even know what the disease is. Within days, entire streets start going silent. Doors are nailed shut. Carts begin collecting bodies in the dark. But here's the terrifying part historians still struggle to explain. Some people survived, and in this video we're going to break down exactly what it took to stay alive in 1348, when medicine barely existed and one disease was wiping out entire cities. In 1348, daily life in Europe was already filled with dangers long before the arrival of the Black Death. Medieval cities were crowded, noisy places where thousands of people lived packed together inside narrow streets and wooden houses. Many towns had grown quickly over the centuries, but sanitation had not kept pace with the expanding population. Waste management was almost non-existent. Household garbage, animal remains, and even human waste were often dumped directly into the streets. In many cities, open gutters carried dirty water through the roads, but these channels frequently clogged, leaving foul-smelling pools that attracted insects and rats. Livestock such as pigs, chickens, and goats wandered freely through towns, feeding on scraps and spreading filth. Homes themselves were not much cleaner. Most buildings were small and poorly ventilated, with entire families sharing a single room. People slept close together, sometimes alongside animals kept indoors during colder months. Clean water was difficult to access in many places, and wells could easily become contaminated. The crowded conditions created an environment where disease could spread rapidly. Illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox were already common parts of medieval life. Outbreaks of sickness frequently swept through towns, and communities had few tools to stop them. Travel and trade made the situation even more dangerous. Merchants, sailors, and caravans constantly moved between cities, carrying goods across long distances. While this trade helped economies grow, it also allowed diseases to travel quickly from one region to another. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was a continent full of busy markets, crowded ports, and tightly packed towns. It was a world where people lived close together, sanitation was poor, and medicine was extremely limited. In many ways, the conditions were perfect for a deadly epidemic to spread. In 1348, medicine in Europe was still deeply rooted in ideas that had been developed more than 1,000 years earlier. Much of medieval medical knowledge came from the writings of ancient Greek physicians, especially the influential Dr. Galen. His theories shaped European medicine for centuries, and by the Middle Ages they were treated almost as unquestionable truths. Central to this system was the belief that the human body was governed by 4 fluids known as the humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval doctors, good health depended on keeping these humors in balance. If one became too dominant, illness would appear. The role of the physician was to restore that balance. Because of this belief, many treatments focused on removing or adjusting these fluids. One of the most common methods was bloodletting, where doctors used knives or leeches to drain blood from the patient. Other treatments included purging the body with strong laxatives, inducing vomiting, or prescribing special diets meant to rebalance the humors. Herbal remedies were also widely used. Plants such as sage, rosemary, and mint were mixed into potions or powders, often combined with honey or wine. Some treatments were based on observation and tradition, but many were guided by superstition or astrology. Doctors sometimes consulted the positions of planets and stars before deciding when to treat a patient. Medical education existed, but it was limited. Universities in places like Bologna and Paris taught medicine, yet most training focused on studying ancient texts rather than experimenting or observing diseases directly. As a result, medieval medicine offered explanations for illness, but very few effective cures. When new and unfamiliar diseases appeared, even trained physicians had little understanding of what they were facing. In 1348, hospitals did exist across Europe, but they were very different from the medical centers people know today. Most medieval hospitals were small religious institutions run by monks, nuns, or charitable groups. Their main purpose was not to cure disease, but to offer shelter, food, and spiritual care to the poor, travelers, and the sick. Many of these hospitals functioned more like hostels than medical facilities. Patients were often placed together in large shared rooms where dozens of people might sleep side by side. The focus was usually on prayer and comfort rather than treatment. Religious staff believed that caring for the sick was an act of charity, and many patients spent as much time receiving spiritual guidance as they did receiving physical care. Medical treatment inside these hospitals was limited. Only a small number of trained physicians were available in most cities, and many hospitals relied on basic remedies such as herbal mixtures, bandaging wounds, or providing rest and food. Serious illnesses were rarely cured, and hospitals sometimes became places where the very sick were sent simply to be cared for until death. When the plague began spreading across Europe in 1348, these institutions quickly became overwhelmed. Patients arrived faster than they could be cared for, and the close quarters inside hospital wards allowed disease to spread rapidly among both the sick and the caretakers. In some towns, hospitals stopped accepting new patients because they could no longer manage the numbers. In others, the staff themselves became ill and died, leaving the buildings nearly abandoned. Instead of stopping the spread of disease, many hospitals unintentionally became places where infection moved even faster, turning centers of charity into dangerous gathering points during the epidemic. In the late 1340s, a disease began moving across trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and the Middle East. By 1347, ships arriving at Mediterranean ports were carrying more than cargo. Hidden among the goods were rats and fleas infected with a deadly bacterium that would soon devastate entire populations. One of the earliest recorded outbreaks in Europe appeared in the port city of Messina in Sicily. According to contemporary accounts, several ships arrived with crews already sick or dying. Within days, people in the city began developing strange and terrifying symptoms. As panic spread, the ships were driven away, but the disease had already taken hold. From southern ports, the plague moved rapidly inland. Merchants, travelers, and soldiers unknowingly carried the infection along busy roads and trade networks. Within a few years, the disease had spread across much of Europe. The illness often began suddenly. Victims developed high fevers, chills, and extreme weakness. Painful swellings called buboes appeared in the neck, armpits, or groin as lymph nodes became infected. These swellings could grow large and dark, sometimes turning black as the infection worsened. Many victims also experienced vomiting, severe headaches, and overwhelming exhaustion. For a large number of people, death came quickly. Some died within 2 or 3 days of the first symptoms appearing. Families often watched multiple members fall sick one after another, sometimes within the same week. Cities were hit particularly hard. Crowded living conditions allowed the disease to move quickly through entire neighborhoods. As death tolls rose, graveyards filled and mass graves were dug outside city walls. Within a few years, the Black Death had killed millions across Europe, becoming one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. As the plague spread across Europe, physicians attempted to treat the sick using the medical knowledge available to them. Many doctors genuinely wanted to help, but they were working with theories that offered little understanding of how the disease actually spread. At the time, a common belief was that illness traveled through bad air, known as miasma. According to this idea, foul smells from rotting waste, dead animals, or stagnant water could poison the air and make people sick. Because of this, doctors often advised people to carry strongly scented items such as flowers, herbs, or spices to protect themselves from harmful air. Treatments also followed the traditional medical practices of the time. Physicians might attempt bloodletting to rebalance the body's humors, or prescribe herbal mixtures meant to strengthen the patient. Some recommended burning fragrant woods or herbs inside homes in hopes of cleansing the air. Protective clothing sometimes appeared as well. In later outbreaks, some doctors wore long robes, gloves, and masks with extended beaks filled with aromatic plants. These outfits were meant to filter dangerous air before it reached the doctor's nose. While these measures offered a small degree of protection, they did not address the real cause of the disease. The risks for physicians were extremely high. Doctors worked closely with infected patients, often without any real protection. Many became ill themselves, and in some cities, large numbers of medical practitioners died during the outbreaks. In other cases, doctors chose to flee heavily infected towns to avoid the disease. Their departure left many communities without any trained medical help at all. Despite their efforts, physicians had no reliable way to stop the plague, and their treatments rarely changed the outcome for those who became seriously ill. As the plague spread and medical treatments failed, ordinary people began searching for their own ways to survive. Without a clear understanding of how the disease worked, communities relied on instinct, observation, and sometimes desperate experimentation. One of the most common responses was isolation. When someone in a household became sick, families sometimes locked themselves inside their homes to avoid contact with the outside world. In certain cities, authorities even ordered infected houses to be sealed. Doors were sometimes nailed shut from the outside to prevent anyone from leaving, forcing entire families to remain inside while the disease ran its course. Others tried to escape the danger by leaving crowded cities altogether. Wealthier families often fled to rural estates or distant villages where populations were smaller and the chances of encountering infected people seemed lower. Historical records show that in many regions the countryside initially experienced fewer outbreaks than major cities. Some communities attempted basic forms of quarantine even though they did not understand germs. Ships arriving at certain ports were occasionally forced to wait before unloading cargo or passengers. These measures were inconsistent and not widely enforced, but they sometimes slowed the spread of infection. People also experimented with everyday habits they believed might offer protection. Strong smells were thought to block dangerous air, so many carried herbs, flowers, or pieces of cloth soaked in vinegar. Homes were filled with smoke from burning plants or incense in hopes of purifying the environment. None of these methods guaranteed safety, yet in some cases avoiding crowds, limiting contact with the sick, or living in less populated areas did reduce the risk of infection. For many families, survival depended on a mixture of caution, circumstance, and the constant hope that the disease would simply pass them by. As the plague continued to spread and death became a constant presence in daily life, many people turned to religion for answers. In medieval Europe, faith played a central role in how communities understood the world, and when a disaster of this scale appeared, it was often interpreted as a sign of divine judgment. Many believed the plague was punishment from God for human sin. In response, churches held special prayer services where people gathered to ask for forgiveness and protection. Entire communities sometimes participated in public processions, walking through the streets while praying and singing hymns in hopes that God would lift the disease from their towns. One of the most dramatic religious movements to appear during this period was the rise of the flagellants. These groups traveled from town to town, performing public rituals of self-punishment. Members whipped themselves repeatedly with leather cords or chains while praying for mercy, believing that suffering would atone for humanity's sins and stop the plague. Large crowds often gathered to watch or participate in these events. While the participants believed they were helping bring an end to the epidemic, the gatherings sometimes had the opposite effect. Bringing large numbers of people together increased the chances of spreading the disease even further. Fear and uncertainty also fueled suspicion within communities. In some regions, rumors spread that certain groups had caused the plague intentionally. These accusations led to violence and persecution, particularly against Jewish communities in several parts of Europe. As the death toll continued to rise, many people struggled to understand why the disaster was happening. With medicine offering no answers, faith, fear, and desperation shaped how societies responded to one of the deadliest crises in history. Despite the enormous death toll, the Black Death did not kill everyone. In nearly every city and village that experienced the plague, some people survived. For centuries, historians and scientists have tried to understand why. One important factor was exposure. Not everyone came into contact with the disease in the same way. The plague spread most easily in crowded environments where infected fleas, rats, and people were close together. Individuals living in less crowded areas, or those who had limited interaction with the sick, sometimes avoided infection entirely. Geography also played a role. Remote villages and isolated farms were less connected to major trade routes, which meant the disease sometimes reached them later or in a weaker form. In some cases, entire communities were spared simply because the infection never arrived in large numbers. Another possible factor was natural resistance. Modern researchers believe that certain people may have had genetic traits that helped their immune systems respond more effectively to the bacteria responsible for the plague. While these individuals could still become sick, they had a greater chance of surviving the infection. Even so, survival was never guaranteed. Medical treatments at the time offered little real protection, and doctors had no way to predict who would recover and who would not. For many people living through the epidemic, the difference between life and death often came down to circumstances beyond their control. Where someone lived, who they encountered, and simple chance could determine whether they faced the disease or avoided it altogether. By the early 1350s, the worst wave of the Black Death began to fade. The disease did not disappear completely, but the massive outbreaks that had swept across Europe gradually slowed. What remained behind was a continent profoundly changed by years of loss. Historians estimate that the Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe, possibly eliminating 1/3 to half of the population. Entire villages were abandoned. Farms were left untended, and many towns struggled to recover from the sudden disappearance of so many workers and families. Yet the catastrophe also reshaped European society in unexpected ways. With so many laborers gone, surviving workers suddenly became more valuable. Peasants and craftsmen could demand higher wages, and in some regions the rigid feudal systems that had dominated medieval life began to weaken. The disaster also exposed the limits of medieval medicine. Doctors, scholars, and rulers were forced to confront the reality that traditional explanations for disease were not enough. Over time, these challenges encouraged slow changes in how people studied illness and cared for the sick. For those who lived through 1348, however, the experience was far more immediate and terrifying. Families watched neighbors vanish within days, entire communities faced waves of sickness, and there were almost no reliable ways to fight the disease. In the end, surviving the Middle Ages during the Black Death rarely depended on medical knowledge or treatment. With no hospitals capable of stopping the plague and no true cures available, survival often came down to isolation, circumstance, and sometimes simple luck. For millions of people, the year 1348 became a reminder of how fragile life could be in a world without modern medicine.